All right, time is up for me, and this has to happen right now. So here we go. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome if you're new, and thanks to everyone else for coming back round. It's late into the night, and it's been a while since I did this to myself, where I gave myself so little time to make this happen. In my defense, I had time designated earlier today to record. I've come to enjoy recording earlier in the day rather than waiting till late at night. And I scheduled some time for myself to do it earlier today. But about an hour before I was going to come up into the attic to do it, my two daughters ran into the room angelically and with great exuberance said, "Daddy, can we go roller skating? Daddy, can we go roller skating?" And if you've been around, you know how I feel about roller skating. It's become one of my newest revived passions. So basically, I blew off recording and went roller skating. And now I'm exhausted and it's late and this has to happen right now or there will be no show this week. And we can't let that happen, can we? Especially not when I have such a fantastic talk to share with you today. Ranju Roy and Dave Charlton are here. They wrote a book called Embodying the Yoga Sutra, Support, Direction, Space. And if you were around a few weeks back, I had Seth Powell and Chase Bossart on. They had a very deep discussion about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We got into it about Nirodha and whether or not we're trying to still the mind or direct the mind, right? Remember that? You might go back and listen to it if you didn't. Well, I got a slew of emails from people who also wanted to come talk about the sutras. And one of those emails was from Ranju, and I took a look at their book, and it's the one that grabbed my attention most. And you will hear why. We have some similar views, and I just really appreciated the way that they chose to tackle the sutras, and the way that they've translated them, and the transparency with which they have done so. I might also mention that next week, we will continue the conversation about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras with a totally different viewpoint. I'm not going to tell you who it is now, but it is a very special guest. Maybe I'll mention it on the other side. I'm not promising, but just to mention that next week there will be another follow-up conversation on the sutras. I just think it's interesting for us to hear many different viewpoints. Today we will be listening to Ranju and Dave. I'm very excited about that. Before we get to it, though, let me mention that I've got some upcoming dates for my Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain Tour 2020. I've been enjoying doing these 2-day intensives with folks. It really is a lovely opportunity to be in the same room and to meet me in a different context, honestly. Not here from the podcast, but in a practice context, to share some ideas and maybe look at some different tools. So if you happen to be in Sarasota, Florida, March 21st and 22nd, I'm going to be there. Austin, Texas, April 11th and 12th. Austin people, where are you at? Let's hang out. Then I'm going to be in Australia, Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. That's May 2nd through May 10th. I'm going to be in Madison, Wisconsin, May 30th, 31st. Toronto, Canada, June 13th and 14th. And there's a few new dates added. I'm going to be in Los Angeles, California, July 18th and 19th. And San Francisco, California, July 25th and 26th. You can find out about all those dates. You can learn about the tour. You can register for any of those dates at jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. All right. Is there anything else? No, I don't think there's anything else. And like I said, it's ridiculously late and it's cold up here. I got my coat on. It's not an ideal situation. So I think we're just going to have to let this be it. My apologies if this feels like a lackluster intro, but sometimes you just got to make do. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and just get to this. What do you say? Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Ranju Roy and Dave Charlton. Hello, Ranju and David.
Hi, Jay. Hi.
I'm so glad that we managed to wrangle the time to make this happen. And we've been juggling some technical issues, but we've managed to arrive here. And I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you both today.
Ditto, yeah. It's good to talk to you as well, Jay. Yeah.
Well, we had some email exchange, but just for you and anybody listening, just to say a little bit about why this conversation is happening for me. Mm-hmm. I, as you know, had a conversation with Seth Powell and Chase Bossart recently on the show about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
Right.
And I've had other conversations about the sutras before, but that one in particular, I got a lot of emails from people after that also wanting to come on to talk about the sutras.
Oh, right.
And, that conversation was so fun and kind of mind-blowing, but it was very, and I mean this in the best possible way, nerdy, like it was very, for folks who maybe weren't as steeped in the text, it was certainly interesting to listen to, but even myself, there are moments where it would like fly over my head,
It was pretty technical, wasn't it?
It was deep. I mean, I loved it. I think it was amazing. But when I think of people using sutras to teach yoga, like I've watched and been in many classes where teachers taught valuable things using ideas from the sutras as practices. And they're not, and it doesn't usually involve in-depth conversations about Purusha and Prakriti or the definition of Nirodha.
Yeah.
It's usually much more about an application of ideas into people's lives. And so I had it in mind that I wanted to have a conversation like that. And that's when your book landed on my doorstep.
Perfect.
Your book, Embodying the Yoga Sutra. And I also just add, I read your little press thing because your subtitle is Support, Direction, Space.
Yeah.
And I read that you guys wanted that to just be the title. And as a writer, I totally relate to that's the title, right? But from a pure marketing standpoint, if you're going to put out a book about Yoga Sutras, it has to say Yoga Sutra in the title, right?
Sure.
But embodying the Yoga Sutra did also encapsulate what I was thinking,
Yeah.
And also just to say, just full disclosure, the fact that you both are so inspired by Desikachar teachings, has a lot to do with it too, because I'm personally inspired by those teachings because they match my experience.
Yes.
And your book did as well. And just to say, that's a very rare thing. I do think there's something about what Desikachar was teaching that I haven't seen in lots of other places I've looked.
Yeah. I think the teachers that studied directly with Desikachar and so the teachers that we studied with were very, very inspirational in being able to translate not just what most people talk about in the Yoga Sutras, which, it's the 8 limbs or maybe 248 Sthira Sukha Masanam, but many, many other concepts from the Yoga Sutra to make them very, very practical and applicable. And that's what inspired us to write this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's what inspires me about Desikachar teachings is this very kind of practical application that's individualized. And, let me also say I have to take this moment. You have to forgive me, but you both studied with Paul Harvey.
We did, yeah.
I've tried to get Paul on, and I know there's a good chance he's going to listen to this. So I'm putting public pressure on him right now in this moment. I know he doesn't like my interview style, but I will be on the best of behavior because I know that Paul is somebody who seemed steeped in Desikachar's teachings in a way that a lot of other people weren't. And
Paul was an extremely faithful, or is a very extremely faithful student of Desikachar's, yeah.
Yeah. And you guys both studied with him. And so anyways, Paul, come on, man. I swear. I'll be on my best behavior.
You're going to be on your good behavior.
I swear. So anyways, I just needed to do that. Now, I want to get to you guys' book. Before we do, let me just take a little moment to learn a little bit about you both because I don't really know much about you. I read a little bit, but maybe first, Ranju, I read that you had this like maybe former life in the NHS. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, did you find your way to Desikachar teachings before or after your time as a therapist at the NHS?
It was before, actually. I started going along to a Iyengar class when I was about 22. I just finished university in Bristol in the UK. And then, strangely, I was reading a book about Krishnamurti, a biography of Krishnamurti. And in that book, Mary Lutyens' book, she was talking about how Krishnamurti started having these lessons with this young yoga teacher called Desikachar. And I saw that in the book, Desikachar was Iyengar's nephew. And so strangely, I was going along to these classes, and then on the wall, this was back in 87 probably, on the wall, it was a little A5 poster which said, "Teachings in the style of TKV Desikachar with Paul Harvey." And so he was the only teacher in the UK at that time teaching in Desikachar's, his only student of Desikachar's at that time. And there he was, teaching in the same hall. I was there on a Thursday, he was there on a Tuesday. So I just rocked up to one of his classes and, in fact, I went to his house and he had just moved. And so I wrote to him, and then I went along on a summer course that he was running that year. And I met Paul and I met Dave, who was also a young rookie. We were both in our early 20s. And that was before I was working in the NHS. I was working in a petrol station, actually. So not a very exciting job at that time. And then I went on to train to become a therapist, and my career as a yoga teacher kind of developed as my career as an art therapist and family therapist developed as well. But I met Dave then at that time.
Oh, that's where you guys met at that summer course with Paul?
Sure. Yeah, that was the first time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a strange coincidence, but we actually went to the same school together when we were about 11 and 12 years old. But Ranju was in a year above me and I didn't know him. But it seemed like our paths were destined to cross at some point at least. And I think it's a strange coincidence, really.
Well, those convergences happen, don't they? Mm-hmm. And, David, I read that you had like a former life as like a mechanical engineer, which isn't that the same for like Desikachar? Didn't he used to be an engineer before he was a yoga teacher too?
He did. That's absolutely right. And my original training was an engineer, and then basically I was a programmer for about 15 years.
Oh. So you were in that must have been the early times for digital, right?
It was, absolutely.
Because stuff's different now than it was back then.
It's so different now.
Dave is very techie, though. Mm-hmm. He's a wizard on this computer.
Then why was he the last one to get his headphones together to get them?
Because he was sorting me out. I tell you, man, he's sorting me out.
Well, interesting. So you had this former life. So how did you go from being an engineer to getting into yoga, being a yoga teacher? Why does that happen for you?
For some reason, I was attracted to yoga from quite a young age. I didn't really know a lot about it, but for some reason, I picked up the odd book and that kind of thing. And then really, when I was at university, I happened to go to university in the same town where Paul Harvey was living. And so it was right at the end of my degree, actually, that I decided to stay in the town of Bath in England. And I was looking around for a yoga course, and I just rang this guy up, and it just happened to be Paul Harvey. And so by pure chance, I just sort of fell into Paul's clutches. And that was it, basically. The rest is history, so they say.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that is a sort of signature, it seems to me, of Desikachar teachings is that it was about like a relationship you developed.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's always been considered to be the key thing. And, that's basically how it's been, I guess. For me, once I've found this particular approach to yoga, although I've kind of, I suppose, put my toe in other approaches and experienced other things, I pretty much 100% stay with this.
Yeah, I understand that. And you both formed this relationship at this summer program with Paul. Did you guys hang out? Did you guys talk, and was that when the friendship really started?
Well, I mean, we were interested because both Dave and I were, we were quite friendly during I guess it's during the late 80s and then through the 90s. And for both of us, probably the primary relationship with Paul was in our one-to-one lessons. So we both had a lot of individual time with Paul, just in one-to-one sessions. But then we would see each other on retreats and weekends and workshops and things, and even going to India a couple of times. But it was only in 2003, I think.
Yeah, 2003, I think you're right.
2003, we were both turning 40, and I decided that I was, I'd been working for 12 or 13 years in the NHS, and I decided that I would try and have a year's sabbatical from my unpaid sabbatical from my health service job to see, because my yoga teaching was taking off and I was doing more and more teaching. So I just wondered whether that was going to be something that I could do. So I took an unpaid sabbatical, and I was talking to Dave at a weekend. I said, I'm going to take a year off, and Dave said, well, I'm going to do that as well, weirdly. So and it was the same January, we both took January 2003 or whatever it was. And so we said, well, it'd be fun to do some work together. Why don't we run some weekends together? And we ran 4 or 5 weekends together, which were just really good. It was great to work with Dave. It was good fun. I think we both brought something a little different to the party, and
we tried to do some unusual things, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
We kind of did some rather fun retreats with some unusual titles. So we had sort of, we called one of them Roots, another one was Out of Your Box. There was a kind of Living Magically. They were a little bit kind of experimental, I guess.
Yeah,
we wanted to have a go with something different, but it was fun.
And then from then on, we then started working much more together. We developed teacher training courses and study courses and all sorts of things.
Right. You guys founded Sadhanamala in 2004, I read. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Only other kind of question I have about your sort of backgrounds or sources is you guys also both mention Peter Herznak, and his name has never come up before, but I mean, I've kind of heard it before, but it's never come up on the show before. Can you say a little something about Peter?
Yeah. Well, when Desikachar originally started teaching Westerners, he kind of got a band of Western students. There was, I think, about 12 at the time who were his principal Western students. Paul was one of them, and Peter Herznak was another of them. So they were kind of like contemporaries. And Peter was Danish by origin, but he lived most of his life in France. And so Peter was a contemporary of Paul's. They both were students of Desikachar's from, I think, the 70s. Was it Ranju, I think?
Peter was half Icelandic, half Danish, and he went, I think, in 1970 to Desikachar when he was in his early 20s, I guess. He was maybe 22, and he stayed there with Desikachar for 5 years. I think he had a year in Malaysia, but basically he really talked about having an apprenticeship there of 5 years where he would be in the clinic with Desikachar, he was just part of the family. And he then went and he lived in the Far East, I think Malaysia for a long time, and then in France and in Denmark as well. But he said that everything that he did after that, he could really take back to those 5 years of intense apprenticeship with Desikachar. So he kind of developed his approach to yoga, which for anybody who knows about Peter Ustinov was unique, slightly different. He definitely had his own take, but absolutely grounded in the study and work that he had done with Desikachar.
I mean, that's very interesting to me. I mean, if you go back into the archive of the show, I did like a whole series of talks just with people who had any kind of direct, time with Desikachar that I could meet, because we had that celebration for him. And it was interesting to me how there was these same teachings that people had received, but then also everybody had individual expressions of them. And so there was differences. Did you guys have direct time with Desikachar?
Yeah, we did. I think we both spent quite a bit of time with him actually over the years at retreats, and both of us went independently to India. The truth of the matter is there's a lot of people who kind of are claiming or making quite a lot of their links to Desikachar. The reality is real serious Western students were relatively few in number, I think, and Paul and Peter were among those originals. So although we did spend quite a lot of time actually with Desikachar over the years, I don't think either of us would claim to be his direct students. No. And yet we both did spend quite a lot of time with him.
I guess when things got, like just yoga in general got bigger and more people were coming and it kind of expanded, those circles there's sort of different circles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well,
can I just say one thing?
Yeah, please do.
About saying this, Desikachar taught different things to different people.
Well, no, wait, I want to correct that because because Chase corrected me on that, and I don't mean that. I think that Desikachar taught the same things in different ways.
Yeah, I would go with
that. I made that clarification with Chase because I said that before, and I don't think he taught different things to different people. I think he was teaching the same thing, but he taught it differently to different people based on.
I think that's a better way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's a good clarification. I corrected myself. I know I said that at some other time.
Yeah.
I guess, well, that does bring us to your guys' book that you put together. And I guess the question I have to start us off there is, the book is really like, it's a consideration of 18 of the sutras on some levels, right? And I'm kind of curious about how you chose those 18. I'm sure there's obvious ones, like, the first one and the second one. There's certain, the grand ones that you knew you had to do. But then there's lots of other ones that you chose. And there's 195 of them. So I'm curious about that process. Like, how did you guys end up boiling it down to these 18?
The majority of the ones that we chose were from books 1 and 2. I mean, there were, I think there are a few from book 3, but the majority were books 1 and 2. One of the ways that we think about the Yoga Sutra is that these 4 chapters have kind of different agendas. So if you think about it in terms of learning to ride a horse, you could think of chapter 1 as being all the different ways that you can ride a horse, that you can gallop, you can trot, you can show jump, you can walk backwards, you can do all these different things with the horse. And sometimes the horse gets into difficulty and then you might have to do certain corrective things to help you with your galloping or whatever. That's chapter 1. Chapter 3 is all the different places you can go with the horse once you've learned how to gallop or trot or canter. Chapter 4 is the one special place that you go to, which takes you to the ultimate state of yoga. And chapter 2 is learning how to break your horse in, learning how to mount your horse, learning how to ride your horse, if you like. So really, for us, chapter 2 is the sadhana pada. It's the chapter on practice, on how you're able to contain your mind, the horse being the mind in this analogy, this metaphor. And then chapter 1 is how the different types of practices that you can do well, samadhi pada. It's a different meditative processes, but there's lots of really good stuff in chapter 1. So the majority of our book are sutras from chapter 1 and chapter 2. They're all pretty much sutras that we have taught often in our yoga teacher trainings. And I think they're probably, they are the heart of the yoga project from as far as we understand, as we understand it, I would say. The 18 sutras that we've picked are the kind of heart of practical applied yoga. Would you say, Dave?
Yeah, I would. I think, the first couple of chapters are about fundamental definitions, about what we consider yoga to be. Then we talk something about its kind of application to individuals. We talk about what we consider to be the essential method of yoga, which for us is abhyasa vairagya. That I think is the essential method. Everything else, in a sense, you could say, is elaboration of that. And then we've kind of gone into the common practices, which essentially is the 8 limbs. I mean, that is what the last part of the book is really. So we've got our fundamental definitions, our essential methods and application, and then we've
also
got
the concept of Vini Yoga.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that. I mean, what I'm hearing from you guys and what kind of jumped out to me when I looked at the book is I started by saying that when people actually utilize sutras in the teachings, it's much more about a kind of practical application. And what I've found is when an idea from the sutras is going to someone's experience of something, then it makes more sense. Like if there's no experience to go with the idea, then it's kind of an abstraction.
Yes.
And so there's a experience that people have of practice, of like doing, breathing, and moving. And there's a process that seems to happen in that for people. And I feel like the sutras you picked sort of went along with that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way, the book is entitled Support, Direction, and Space, which is a, particular formulation, if you like, of our approach, and was the approach really that Peter took. But I think if we think of how we're using the Yoga Sutra, we're using it as a support. We're using it as a support to inform our experience, our practice, and our understanding of practice. And so, if you were to look at what some of the things we've said from academic context, I don't think we're way off the mark, but we've certainly taken a few liberties in our interpretation. And that really is so that the text can be a very practical support for people in what they're doing.
Well, it's lovely of you to make that admission, because people don't always like to talk about that there's this interpretation element that comes in translation. And the scholars hate it when I mention it, because they're always like, well, there's not that much interpretation. And I'm sure, that's true on some levels, but there's always a certain level of... Yeah,
there is. And I mean, I think, your conversation, for example, between Seth and Chase, in a sense, I think really brought that out. And
right.
It was kind of curious, I think, for me, and me and Ranju discussed it, to listen to that in the sense that I didn't find it at all surprising, their differences.
No.
For me, Chase was so Desikachar's student.
Yes.
And Seth was representing, a pure reading of this text. Yeah. And for us, it kind of highlighted the difference between the principles, as we understand it, of pravritti and nivritti, which is, the tension there's been in the Indian tradition throughout its history between sort of approaches to practice, which essentially see life as an obstacle to your spiritual development and something that you need to, in some sense, withdraw from, and approaches that embrace life and see spiritual practice as part of your engagement in life. And I think what Desikachar did is he and Krishnamacharya, they took this text, Yoga Sutra, which, is normally understood even within the tradition itself to have really a very nivritti approach, and
pure reading is nivritti, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and they applied it. They made it pravritti. They made it something to assist your life, as a support for your life, as a support to allow you to practice yoga in life. And I think that's how one needs to use spiritual texts, because if they don't have any practical value, then you kind of wonder, what is their value?
Is that like a definition of Vinaya?
What a pravritti take on the Yoga Sutra.
Well, what you just said, that kind of idea of yoga being this way of bringing us into our lives, not this transcending them or something, or however you said it much nicer, the way that you put it.
Well, I think Vinaya is about specific application to an individual. And if an individual is living their life in the world, then that's the kind of yoga you want to be teaching, explaining, practicing. I think, for Krishnamacharya and Desikacharya, it seems very clear that their approach was yoga for life, yoga in life. And I think, Chase was representing that position beautifully, actually.
Yes, I know. I thought so too. And you said that your book started with like fundamental definitions, and there is differences of interpretation when it comes to that. And you wrote in the book, two of you, yoga as relationship, and I'm going to quote it. It says, "The fundamental meaning of the term yoga is to engage in relationship with something to bring about positive change."
Yeah.
And that is not the same fundamental meaning of the term yoga that I've heard proffered by lots of other people. That is the starting point for this idea about yoga that is different.
Well, I'll tell you one of the ways that we came up with that idea is that we looked in the dictionary. The Sanskrit English dictionary. Yeah, Monia Williams. And if you look at the entry for yoga, it's huge. And most of its meanings have nothing to do with what we might consider to be a spiritual practice. And so kind of looking at all of those and thinking, well, what have all these got in common? And it kind of started to become obvious that actually what is consistent in most of those meanings and what is actually consistent with all of the more specialist meanings as well is this idea that yoga is about engaging with something in order to produce a beneficial result. That seems to me to be a kind of a fundamental somehow. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I mean, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me because that, again, is my experience. Like engaging, being in relationship with myself, my breath, my body became a precedence for being in relationship with other people. And in that relating to myself, I come to see myself as this wonder of nature or something. And then I want to be an agent for positive change, just very naturally.
I think Desikacharya himself really emphasized the yoga as relationship angle of the meaning of yoga. I mean, as Dave said, there are 1,500 different definitions of the term yoga, and some of them are quite, magic trick, illusion, or they're also meanings of yoga. But I suppose the two fundamental meanings of yoga which come out in the Yoga Sutra, the fundamental meaning, and I think Seth and Chase referred to this a little bit in their podcast, was the meaning of yoga, meaning samadhi. Mm-hmm. So the root being yujir. Was it yujir, Dave? Is it yujir? Samadhi. And the other one as yuj, which means to link together, to bring into relationship. So you've got two fundamental meanings, one about a kind of a meditative process and one about bringing into relationship. Now, the fundamental meaning in the Yoga Sutra is definitely, according to one of the commentators, is the samadhi, the meditative meaning. Yoga is meditation. But in its practical application, it's useful to bear in mind that yoga also means bringing into relationship.
And also, I mean, if you think about it, the meditative use of or understanding of the term yoga is certainly on all of the practical levels of meditation, at least, is about a relationship where, you know, in which you focus the mind or you use a particular support for the mind. It's as if the specialist meaning in the Yoga Sutra is a kind of specialized example of the general meaning.
Yes, that's nicely put.
So both of them, I think, have value in understanding what the term means.
Yeah, they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
No, they're not mutually exclusive, and I think this is one of the things that I would certainly feel quite strongly about, is that actually in the Indian tradition there are often multiple meanings that can be associated with words, and although there is often a primary meaning, it's not uncommon for the subsidiary meanings to have value as well. So I think there's a danger in looking for the meaning, when in fact often there are a range of meanings and all of them have something to contribute, or many of them will have something to contribute to an overall understanding of what you're talking about and its practical application.
That sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. Ranju, did you want to say something?
Only that I agree with Dave.
Yes, I too. I'm agreeing with him. And, you know, at the risk of taking us down a rabbit hole, and I will pull us out of it if we start to fall too deep into it, I did read something in your book that jumped out to me, because you referenced something that I have often thought is that this most common definition of the word yoga that means to mean union. Mm-hmm. And I have often said what you wrote, that I don't always like that word because it seems to imply like two things coming together. Mm-hmm. And that does get us to this sort of non-duality question. And you guys wrote something about two things remain separate but are linked. And so I'm sort of curious to hear either of you speak about that idea that yoga means union, whereas you're saying it kind of means more about relationship.
Well, one of the ways we can think about this whole question is by contrasting the term yoga and the term samyoga. So as we understand it, when you bring two principles into a relationship of yoga, those two principles remain functional and free within relationship to each other, and the combination of the two things enables you to do something else. So the classic example is the yoking of a plough and an ox,
right? Or
the yoking of two oxen with a single yoke, and then the two oxen, they don't become one; they become a single unit, but each retains its own individuality. So they're brought into relationship, and by bringing them into relationship, they are able to do something new. That's not the same as merging together as one. And quite often, Patanjali talks about this in chapter 2, that one of the big problems is that things merge together, bleed together, and there's this confusion, a fusion which creates confusion, and one thing can't be seen for another thing, and that he calls samyoga. So samyoga is a kind of a confusing state of union, and part of the yoga project, as we understand it from Patanjali, is what's actually called V-yoga, which means to separate out, to actually create some clarity and some clarification, to separate out in order to bring two things into a new relationship.
See, that's interesting. Bringing things into relationship, allowing them to have their own individuality, but at the same time, it's not like they merge and become one. They still function as a whole complex thing, working together in harmony or something, right?
If you're literally in a relationship with somebody, then a healthy relationship with somebody really is not a blur. It's not that you become,
Yeah. Everybody knows that who's married. You know that.
Exactly.
Anybody who's married knows that.
So in a marriage or in any kind of relationship, if you're not sure whether this is my stuff or your stuff, or this is, that's a very common thing that happens in any long-term relationship, is that we get stuff accrues in the kind of gap between the relationship, and what happens is that stuff which accrues gets sticky and then turns the relationship into one thing. So there's no individual freedom, because as soon as one person says something, the other person reacts. I mean, I'm talking in terms of people, but another way we use this same idea is in if you think of two bones in the body, like the femur and the hip, and the pelvis, for example. They are in a relationship with
yes, they cannot exist without each other in a way.
And they support each other. And sometimes one remains stable and the other moves, and sometimes the other remains stable and the first one moves. But if you get a load of stuff accruing, a lot of gunk, I mean, technical term, gunk, but if you get a lot of stuff in the between them, then as soon as one moves, the other starts moving, or there's a pain, or they get kind of glued together, and that's how potentially, that's how we understand potentially to describe this concept of samyoga. So yoga is not about samyoga; it's not about making things one. It's about respecting the individuality of each of the components in a relationship, but their joint project is bigger than either of them.
And how can they relate together in a way that would be, for, as you said, the positive change, right? How could they relate?
I think that links to the subtitle of our book, which is Support, Direction and Space. And really, in order for there to be a healthy relationship, there needs to be support at either end. This could be the relationship between the breath and the body, or it could be the relationship between a bone and another bone, or it could be the relationship between one person and another person. So there are many different levels that you can apply this. But if there's one element is a support, which gives a direction to the other element, which opens a space.
See, that's the process I'm talking. That's the exact kind of process I was talking about before that you go through in practice. I get your title.
yeah, and Jay, I think I need to point something out actually that Ranju's doing quite unwittingly. Is that, and I think this is a really important thing to highlight, is that those people who know their Yoga Sutra very well, for example, will be hearing Ranju talk about Samyoga. And they will appreciate that it has a very, very technical sense in the Yoga Sutra, for example. It's talking about some yoga situation between essentially Purusha and Buddhi, Purusha and mind. Mm. But what I think has been so extraordinary, and I think this goes back to Desikachar, maybe Krishnamacharya, certainly in our experience of Desikachar, and the way that his students have interpreted and continued his work, is to appreciate that a lot of these principles which seem to be described in the Yoga Sutra and are referring to very highfalutin philosophical concepts, they have a very technical meaning, they seem to reproduce themselves endlessly in the world around us.
Yeah, that's nice.
So we're actually taking principles that have got a very, very technical meaning, and we are seeing them kind of, I don't know what the right word is that it's almost as if they seem to work themselves out in all sorts of very practical ways. So Ranju's talking about, relationships. He's talking about bones in the body. You were talking about breathing and moving. Mm. And yet we're using a language from the Yoga Sutra that has a very particular philosophical meaning. But what we find is it works.
Yeah. Yeah. We're putting a lot of words to something that happens often quite naturally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just to do that, I want to get to some of the other things in terms of support and direction and space. But I also, I want to do one more of these like little bit of technical things, because there's something that you wrote in the book that really jumped out at me, because when I talked with Seth and Chase, we had this whole long conversation about Nirodha. And, Chase did a whole dissertation on paper on it or whatever. And you guys wrote something that I hadn't seen elsewhere. You guys wrote something about there being, first of all, the sutra, right, the chittavritti nirodha, there's 2 levels of chittavritti. And that one of them was this one-pointedness, and that the nirodha was actually, you wrote, cannot be practiced in an ordinary sense. It may or may not arise. Yeah. And that really piqued my ears up. Can you guys speak to what you were talking about when you wrote that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems very clear from Yoga Sutra and particularly from Vyasa's commentary. I know there's, some discussion about the place of Vyasa, but most people would admit that he has some good stuff to say, at least.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.